There is an old saying in Stockholm, Sweden: some places don't just hold memories, they create them. On a quiet cobblestone street in Gamla stan, the oldest part of the city, stood a small coffee shop called Fika Haven. It wasn't the biggest cafe in Stockholm. It didn't have fancy decorations or expensive furniture. But people came from all over the city for one very unusual reason. Near the large window overlooking the narrow streets stood Table 9. An ordinary wooden table. 2 simple chairs. Nothing about it looked special. Yet everyone in the cafe knew its story. For more than 25 years, countless couples had shared their very first date at Table 9. Many of them later returned wearing wedding rings. Some brought their children. Others celebrated silver anniversaries at the exact same table. The staff jokingly called it the table that falls in love first. No one could explain why. Maybe it was just coincidence. Or maybe some stories truly begin in ordinary places. Every morning before sunrise, David Anderson unlocked the front door of Fika Haven. At 31 years old, David had owned the cafe for almost 5 years after inheriting it from his grandfather. His grandfather had taught him one simple lesson. People don't always remember the coffee, but they'll always remember how you made them feel. David never forgot those words. He greeted every customer by name. He remembered birthdays, favorite drinks, even the little details that others overlooked. To him, the cafe wasn't just a business. It was home. One chilly Saturday morning in early autumn, as golden leaves drifted through the streets of Gamla stan, David noticed someone new. A young woman stepped quietly into the cafe. She wore a long beige coat, a cream scarf, and carried a worn blue notebook tucked under one arm. Her chestnut brown hair rested gently on her shoulders, and her calm green eyes seemed to observe everything before she spoke. She smiled politely. "Good morning." "Good morning," David replied warmly. "What can I get for you?" "A cinnamon bun and a cappuccino, please." Her voice was soft but confident. David prepared the order himself. When he placed the coffee on the tray, she looked around the cafe. Almost every table was empty. Yet she walked directly toward Table 9 beside the window. She sat down, opened her blue notebook, and began writing. Not texting, not reading, writing page after page. For nearly an hour, she hardly looked up. Then she quietly closed the notebook, thanked David with a gentle smile, and left. The following Saturday, she returned. Same time. Same cappuccino. Same cinnamon bun. Same Table 9. Same blue notebook. The Saturday after that, she came again. And then again. Week after week. Month after month. She never missed a Saturday. She always sat alone, she always wrote, and she always left exactly 1 hour later. One afternoon, David's oldest regular customer, Mrs. Ingrid Nilsson, noticed him watching the young woman through the cafe counter. She smiled knowingly. "You're curious," David laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" Mrs. Ingrid nodded. "Very. What do you think she's writing?" David shrugged. "I have no idea. But every Saturday, it's like she's waiting for someone who never arrives." Mrs. Ingrid looked toward Table 9. Then she smiled. Or maybe she's simply waiting for the right story to begin. David looked back at the quiet woman writing in her notebook. For reasons he couldn't explain, he had a feeling that Mrs. Ingrid was right. And neither of them knew that before the leaves had fallen from the trees, Table 9 was about to witness another unforgettable first date. By the time October arrived, Charlotte had become a familiar face at Fika Haven. Every Saturday morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, the little bell above the cafe door would ring. David didn't even need to ask what she wanted anymore. A hot cappuccino. 1 fresh cinnamon bun. Extra cinnamon sprinkled on top. As soon as Charlotte stepped inside, David would already be preparing her order. She would smile warmly and say the same words every week. Thank you, David, somehow. Hearing his name in her calm voice always made his morning a little brighter. Charlotte never stayed longer than an hour. She always sat at table 9, opened her blue notebook, and filled page after page with neat handwriting. She never used her phone. Never wore headphones. The cafe around her buzzed with quiet conversations, clinking coffee cups, and soft jazz music. But Charlotte seemed to exist in her own peaceful world. David often found himself wondering what was hidden inside those pages. Was she writing a novel? Poems? Or perhaps recording memories she never wanted to forget? He was curious, but he respected her privacy. One rainy Saturday, the cafe was busier than usual. People hurried inside to escape the cold weather. Every table was occupied. Charlotte arrived a few minutes later than normal. As always, David smiled. Your usual? She nodded. Please. Just as David placed her cappuccino on the tray, a young man carrying 2 drinks accidentally bumped into Charlotte. The tray slipped. Coffee splashed across the floor and onto her blue notebook. Oh no. The young man looked horrified. I'm so sorry. Charlotte quickly picked up the notebook. Several pages were soaked with coffee. David rushed over with a stack of napkins. I'm really sorry, he said. Let me help. Together, they carefully dried the notebook as best they could. Charlotte looked at the stained pages and sighed softly. I guess accidents happen. The customer apologized again before moving to another table. David looked at Charlotte with concern. Was it important? She smiled gently. For the first time, he noticed sadness hiding behind her smile. A few minutes later, David walked over carrying another cappuccino. This one's on the house. Charlotte looked surprised. You don't have to do that. I know. I wanted to. She smiled. Thank you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the cafe windows. Finally, David gathered the courage to ask. Can I ask you something? Charlotte closed the notebook. You've been wondering about this for weeks, haven't you? David laughed. Was I that obvious? A little. He pointed toward the blue notebook. What do you write every Saturday? Charlotte looked down at the worn cover. For several seconds, she remained silent. Then she smiled. It's not a diary. It's not a novel either. David waited patiently. It's something much more personal. Before he could ask another question, another customer called his name from across the cafe. David, could we get 2 more coffees? He sighed dramatically. Duty calls. Charlotte laughed for the first time since they had met. I'll tell you someday. David smiled. I'll remember that. As Charlotte prepared to leave an hour later, she slipped the notebook back into her bag. Before opening the cafe door, she turned around. By the way, David looked up. Thanks for saving my notebook. He smiled. I think it was worth saving. Charlotte held his gaze for a brief moment. Then she quietly walked out into the rain. David watched through the window as she disappeared down the cobblestone street. Mrs. Ingrid, who had been reading her newspaper nearby, folded it with a knowing smile. You smiled a lot today. David looked confused. Did I? Mrs. Ingrid chuckled. You only smile like that when life is about to surprise you. David looked toward the empty table 9. For the first time, he couldn't wait for Saturday to come again. Saturday arrived once again. As always, the little bell above the cafe door chimed at exactly 9 o'clock. David looked up from the espresso machine. There she was. Charlotte smiled as she walked inside. Good morning. Good morning, David replied. Your cappuccino is already waiting. She laughed softly. I think you know my order better than I do, and you know exactly where you'll sit. David glanced toward table 9. Charlotte smiled. I guess we're both creatures of habit. The cafe was unusually quiet that morning. A light snowfall had begun outside, covering the rooftops of Stockholm with a thin blanket of white. Only a few customers sat inside. Mrs. Ingrid waved at Charlotte before returning to her crossword puzzle. Charlotte settled into her usual seat and opened her blue notebook. But this time, she didn't start writing immediately. Instead, she stared out the window, watching snowflakes drift through the air. David noticed. He poured himself a cup of coffee and walked over. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" Charlotte looked up and smiled. "Not at all." David sat across from her. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt comfortable. Finally, David looked at the notebook. "You promised you'd tell me someday." Charlotte smiled. "I did." She gently ran her fingers across the faded blue cover. "When I was 22, my grandmother gave me this notebook." David listened quietly. "Before she passed away, she told me something I'll never forget." Charlotte's voice softened. "Don't spend your life waiting for perfect love. Spend your life becoming the person you'd want someone to fall in love with." David smiled. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Charlotte looked down at the notebook again. "So every Saturday, I write a letter." David tilted his head. "A letter?" She nodded. "To my future husband." David blinked in surprise. "Your future husband?" Charlotte laughed nervously. "I know it sounds strange. Most people think I'm crazy." David shook his head. "I don't." She looked relieved. "I don't know who he'll be. I don't know where we'll meet. I don't even know if he exists. But every week, I write about my life. The things that make me happy. The things that scare me. The dreams I haven't achieved yet." She smiled gently. "So if I ever meet him, he'll know who I was before we became us." David looked at the notebook with new appreciation. "That's actually beautiful." Charlotte looked out the window. "I just don't want the person I marry to meet a stranger. I want him to know my whole story." For a long moment, David didn't say a word. Something about Charlotte's honesty touched him deeply. Just then, Ingrid walked over carrying her empty teacup. "I couldn't help overhearing." Charlotte looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry." Ingrid smiled warmly. "Don't be." She looked at the blue notebook. "You know, my husband wrote me letters for 43 years. Charlotte smiled. "He did?" Ingrid nodded. "Even after we got married, he said love should never stop introducing itself." Charlotte's eyes filled with emotion. "That's beautiful." Ingrid winked. "Maybe one day someone will write letters back to you." She quietly walked away. An hour passed faster than either of them realized. Charlotte closed her notebook and stood up. "I should go." David nodded, though he secretly wished she could stay longer. As she reached the cafe door, she suddenly turned back. "Oh, David? Yes?" "If someone ever sat here with me," she looked at table 9 and smiled. "I think that would mean they're pretty special." Before David could answer, she walked outside into the softly falling snow. He stood there, watching her disappear down the quiet street. Then, he looked at the empty chair across from table 9. For the first time, he found himself wondering what it would feel like to be the person sitting there. Little did he know, the answer was closer than he ever imagined. Winter settled gently over Stockholm. The streets of Gamla Stan sparkled beneath fresh snow, and warm lights glowed from the windows of old buildings. Inside Fika Haven, the aroma of fresh coffee and cinnamon filled the air. Saturday mornings had quietly become David's favorite part of the week. Not because business was better, but because he knew Charlotte would walk through the door. As always, the little bell chimed at exactly 9 o'clock. Charlotte stepped inside, brushing snowflakes from her coat. David looked up from behind the counter. "Good morning." She smiled. "Good morning." He handed her cappuccino across the counter. "You were right on time. I don't like keeping coffee waiting." David laughed. "Or maybe you don't like keeping me waiting." Charlotte looked at him for a second before smiling. Maybe both. The cafe was unusually crowded that morning. Every table was occupied. Every table except one. Table 9. David glanced around the room. Then, carrying his own coffee mug, he walked toward Charlotte. Looks like we're sharing the last table today. She looked at the empty chair across from her. I don't mind. David sat down. Neither of them realized it, but for the first time, table 9 wasn't occupied by one person. It was occupied by two. Their conversation began with simple things. Favorite coffee, favorite books, favorite places in Stockholm. Charlotte admitted she loved visiting the public library more than shopping malls. David laughed. I thought I was the only person under 40 who actually enjoys libraries. Charlotte smiled. They're peaceful. They remind me that every person has a story waiting to be discovered. David nodded. I guess that's why I love this cafe. Every customer walks in carrying a story. Some are joyful, some are heartbreaking, but everyone leaves a little different than when they arrived. Time seemed to disappear. They talked about childhood memories, family traditions, and their dreams for the future. David shared stories about learning to bake with his grandfather after school. Charlotte confessed that, as a little girl, she had dreamed of writing novels. So why didn't you? David asked. She smiled sadly. I was afraid no one would read them. David looked at her with complete sincerity. I would. Charlotte lowered her eyes, trying to hide the smile growing on her face. Just then, Mrs. Ingrid walked past their table with her teacup. She stopped for a moment, looked at David, then at Charlotte. Finally, she smiled. So, David looked confused. So what? Mrs. Ingrid chuckled. I've been coming to this cafe for 15 years, and today I finally get to see someone sitting across from Charlotte at table 9. Charlotte laughed. It's not what you think. Mrs. Ingrid raised an eyebrow. No? David smiled. We're just talking. Mrs. Ingrid grinned knowingly. That's exactly how every love story in this cafe has started. Before either of them could reply, she walked away, leaving both of them blushing. By the time Charlotte looked at her watch, she gasped. Oh no. David looked surprised. What happened? I've been here for almost 3 hours. She laughed. I've never stayed this long. David smiled. I guess conversation is stronger than your schedule. Charlotte stood and picked up her coat. As she reached for her purse, something slipped onto the floor. It was her blue notebook. David bent down to pick it up. As he handed it back, a small folded piece of paper fell from between the pages. Charlotte quickly picked it up before he could read it. She smiled nervously. That's private. David raised his hands with a laugh. I didn't see anything. I know. She carefully tucked the paper back inside. Maybe someday. David smiled. I'll wait. Charlotte walked toward the cafe door, then paused. She turned around and looked at David. You know something? What? She smiled warmly. I think this was the nicest Saturday I've had in a very long time. David felt his heart skip a beat. It was mine too. Charlotte waved goodbye before disappearing into the snowy streets. David stood beside the window, watching her walk away. Mrs. Ingrid quietly approached him with a gentle smile. You know what? You've just had your first date. David looked surprised. We didn't call it a date. Mrs. Ingrid laughed softly. The best ones usually aren't planned. David glanced toward table 9, where 2 empty coffee cups still sat side by side. For the first time, the famous table had witnessed another beginning. Neither David nor Charlotte realized it yet. But their love story had already started. After that Saturday, something quietly changed between David and Charlotte. They didn't need to make plans. Every Saturday morning, they simply knew the other person would be at Fika Haven. What had once been an hour of quiet writing had turned into hours of laughter, conversations, and shared coffee. The customers noticed. Mrs. Ingrid noticed. Even Eric, David's childhood friend, noticed. One afternoon, Eric leaned against the calf counter with a teasing smile. "So," David looked up from polishing coffee cups. "So what? You smile every Saturday now." David laughed. "Do I?" Eric nodded. And somehow it always happens when Charlotte walks through that door. David tried to hide his smile. "I think you're imagining things." Eric chuckled. "No, my friend, I think you're falling in love." David didn't answer, because deep inside, he knew Eric was right. The following Saturday, heavy snow covered Stockholm. Only a handful of customers came to the cafe. Charlotte arrived wearing a dark green coat and a knitted white scarf. As she stepped inside, David greeted her with a warm smile. "I was starting to think the snow would keep you away." Charlotte laughed. "It would take more than snow to stop me from coming here." Those simple words stayed with David all morning. After they finished their coffee, Charlotte looked at her blue notebook. Then, for the first time since David had met her, she slowly pushed it across the table. David looked surprised. "What's this?" She smiled nervously. "You've been curious about it for months." "I have. I think. I'm finally ready." David looked at her. "Ready for what?" "Open it." His hands hesitated as he lifted the worn blue cover. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters. Each page began the same way. "Dear future husband." David carefully turned the pages. One letter described Charlotte's first day at university. Another talked about losing her grandmother. Another spoke about her dreams of becoming a writer. Then he reached a newer page. His eyes stopped. The letter read, "Dear future husband, today I met someone who makes Saturdays feel different. His name is David. He owns a little coffee shop in Gamla Stan. He always remembers my order before I ask. He smiles with his eyes before he smiles with his lips. And for the first time, I think my future might already know my name." David's heart began to race. He slowly looked up. Charlotte was watching him quietly. Her cheeks had turned pink. "I wasn't supposed to read that, was I?" he asked softly. She smiled. "I wanted you to." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe around them seemed to disappear. Only the two of them remained. Finally, David closed the notebook gently. "I don't know what to say." Charlotte laughed nervously. "You don't have to, but I do." He took a deep breath. "I've been looking forward to every Saturday because of you. When you're not here, the cafe feels quieter." Charlotte's eyes shimmered with emotion. "So, it's not just me?" David smiled. "No, it's definitely not just you." Just then Mrs. Ingrid walked past their table. She stopped when she noticed both of them smiling. Without saying a word, she quietly placed a small heart-shaped cookie between them. Then she whispered, "Some stories write themselves." Before either of them could respond, she walked away. Charlotte looked at the cookie and laughed. "I think she knows." David smiled. "I think she's known for weeks." As the afternoon sunlight poured through the cafe window, David reached across the table. Not to hold Charlotte's hand, not yet. Instead, he gently placed his hand beside hers, close enough for her to know how he felt. Charlotte looked at him. Then, without saying a single word, she moved her hand until their fingers touched. It was the smallest gesture. But to both of them, it felt like the beginning of something extraordinary. Outside, snow continued to fall over the streets of Stockholm. Inside Fika Haven, Table 9 had quietly witnessed another first. Not just a first date, but the first moment two hearts admitted what they had been feeling all along. From that day on, David and Charlotte were no longer just two people sharing coffee. They were a couple. Every Saturday still began at Table 9, but now it never ended there. After closing the cafe, David and Charlotte wandered through the snowy streets of Gamla, hand in hand. Sometimes they visited bookstores hidden in narrow alleys. Sometimes they crossed the bridges overlooking the frozen waters of Stockholm. And sometimes they simply walked in silence, enjoying each other's company. David had never imagined that happiness could feel so simple. Charlotte often smiled and said, "I think my grandmother was right." David looked at her. About what? That the right love arrives when you're busy becoming yourself. 6 months passed. Spring brought color back to the city. One evening, David closed the cafe earlier than usual. He had planned a surprise picnic in Djurgården Park. As Charlotte admired the flowers surrounding the lake, David reached into his coat pocket. Inside was a small velvet ring box. His hands trembled. "Charlotte." She turned around. Before she could say a word, David knelt on one knee. Her eyes widened. "I've spent my whole life serving coffee to strangers," he said with a nervous smile. "But somewhere along the way, a stranger became the most important person in my life." He opened the ring box. "Charlotte Lindbergh, will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes before he had even finished speaking. She nodded over and over. "Yes, of course I'll marry you." David slipped the ring onto her finger. As they embraced, people walking through the park applauded. For both of them, it felt like the beginning of forever. 3 months later, wedding plans filled their weekends. Charlotte had chosen a simple white dress. David had reserved a beautiful lakeside venue just outside Stockholm. Mrs. Ingrid was already joking about dancing until midnight. Everything seemed perfect until one ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Charlotte received a phone call while editing a manuscript at work. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello?" A calm voice answered. "Miss Lindbergh? This is Karolinska University Hospital. We're calling about your father." Charlotte's smile disappeared. Her father, who had been living in northern Sweden, had suffered a serious heart attack. He needed surgery. And afterward, someone would need to stay with him during his recovery. Charlotte's hands began to shake. Is he going to be okay? The doctors are optimistic. But he'll need his family. That evening, Charlotte sat across from David at table 9 after the cafe had closed. For the first time since they had met, neither of them touched their coffee. "I have to go," Charlotte whispered. David nodded slowly. "I know. My father needs me. I don't know how long I'll be away." The silence between them felt heavier than ever before. Finally, David reached across the table and held her hand. "Family comes first." Charlotte looked at him with tears in her eyes. "I'm afraid." "Of what?" She took a deep breath. "That life will change while I'm gone." David squeezed her hand gently. "Then we'll face that change together." She smiled through her tears. "I wish it were that simple." The next morning, David drove Charlotte to Stockholm Central Station. The train waited quietly at the platform. Passengers hurried past, carrying luggage and saying emotional goodbyes. Charlotte hugged David tightly. "I'll call every day. I'll answer every time." She smiled, and when I come back, David finished her sentence. "We'll finally get married." Charlotte nodded. "I promise." The train doors slowly closed. David watched as it disappeared into the distance. For the first time in months, table 9 would have only one chair occupied again. Neither of them knew it yet, but this unexpected separation was only the beginning. Because sometimes the hardest test of love isn't learning how to fall in love. It's learning how to hold on when life pulls you apart. The first Saturday without Charlotte felt strangely quiet. At exactly 9 o'clock, David found himself looking toward the cafe door, almost expecting to hear the familiar bell ring. But it never did. Instead, table 9 remained half empty. One chair was occupied by David. The other waited silently by the window. For the first time in almost a year, Charlotte wasn't there. Hundreds of kilometers away, in Umeå, northern Sweden, Charlotte spent her days at the hospital beside her father. The surgery had been successful, but recovery would take months. Every morning, she helped him with his medication. Every afternoon, she read him chapters from his favorite novels. Every evening, she called David. No matter how tired they were, they never missed a single call. "How's the calf?" Charlotte would ask. David smiled, even though she couldn't see him. "Mrs. Ingrid still beats everyone at crossword puzzles." Charlotte laughed. "And Eric? He still thinks he can make better coffee than I do." "He can't, I know." Those small conversations became the brightest part of their day. One snowy evening, Charlotte looked out of the hospital window. "I miss Stockholm." David's voice softened. "Stockholm misses you too." She smiled sadly. "I miss Table 9. David looked across the calf at the empty chair. "It's waiting for you." "So am I." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sometimes silence carried more love than words ever could. Weeks turned into months. Spring slowly returned to Sweden. The streets filled with flowers. Tourists crowded Gamla stan. Life moved forward. But for David, something was missing. One Saturday morning, Mrs. Ingrid walked into the cafe carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. She placed it on the counter. "For Charlotte." David looked confused. "What's inside?" "A photo." She smiled gently. "I found it while cleaning my house." David carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was an old photograph taken nearly 20 years earlier. It showed a young couple sitting at table 9, laughing over 2 cups of coffee. "Mrs. Ingrid pointed at the smiling woman. "That's me." David smiled. "And your husband?" She nodded. "Our very first date happened right here." She looked toward the famous table. "When he passed away, people kept telling me to move on." She paused for a moment. "But love doesn't disappear. It simply changes the way it stays with us." David quietly listened. Mrs. Ingrid placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Distance doesn't end real love. If anything, it reminds you why it's worth waiting for." That afternoon, David had an idea. He took out a blank notebook from one of the calf shelves. On the first page, he wrote, "Dear Charlotte, today a little boy spilled hot chocolate all over his shoes and somehow blamed the marshmallows." Mrs. Ingrid laughed so hard she almost dropped her tea. "Eric still burns the cinnamon rolls whenever I'm not watching. And table 9 still saves your chair. I'm counting the Saturdays until you come home. Love, David." He smiled. If Charlotte had spent years writing letters to someone she hadn't met, he could certainly write letters to the woman he loved. Every Saturday after closing the cafe, David wrote another letter. Some were funny, some were romantic, some were only a few sentences long, but every single one ended the same way. "I'll be here when you come home." 3 months later, Charlotte's father had recovered enough to walk on his own. One evening, he noticed Charlotte quietly reading one of David's letters. He smiled. "He's a good man." Charlotte looked up. "The best." Her father reached into his pocket and handed her a train ticket. She frowned. "What's this?" "A trip home." "Dad, I can't leave you." He smiled warmly. "You stayed until I could stand again. Now it's time to go stand beside the man who's been waiting for you." Tears filled Charlotte's eyes. But no buts. He gently squeezed her hand. "If you keep making that poor boy wait, he might drink all the cappuccino by himself." Charlotte laughed through her tears. For the first time in months, she was going home. Little did she know, David had already planned a surprise that would turn her return into the happiest day of her life. The train from northern Sweden arrived at Stockholm Central Station just after sunrise. Charlotte stepped onto the platform with a small suitcase in one hand and David's notebook of letters held tightly in the other. She had read every page during the journey. Some letters made her laugh, some made her cry, and every single one reminded her that no matter how many kilometers separated them, David had never stopped loving her. She smiled to herself. I'm finally coming home. Instead of calling David, Charlotte decided to surprise him. She took a taxi through the familiar streets of Stockholm. As they entered Gamla Stan, her heart beat faster. The old buildings, the narrow cobblestone streets, the smell of fresh pastries drifting through the morning air. Everything felt exactly the same. When the taxi stopped outside Fika Haven, Charlotte paid the driver and stood quietly across the street. Through the large cafe window, she could see David behind the counter, carefully making coffee for the morning customers. For a moment, she simply watched him. He looked a little older, a little more tired, but his gentle smile hadn't changed. Charlotte slowly pushed open the cafe door. The little bell above it rang. David was steaming milk for a cappuccino. Without looking up, he said with a smile, "Good morning. I'll be with you in just a moment." Charlotte couldn't help smiling. It's okay. I've already waited long enough. David froze. The milk pitcher slipped slightly in his hand. He slowly turned around. Standing near the entrance, smiling through tears, was Charlotte. For a second, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Then David rushed across the cafe. He wrapped his arms around her so tightly that Charlotte almost laughed. I missed you, he whispered. Charlotte held him just as tightly. I missed you too. The customers quietly smiled as they watched the reunion. Even Eric discreetly wiped away a tear. Mrs. Ingrid simply whispered, I knew she'd come home. Later that afternoon, after the cafe had closed, David looked at Charlotte with a mysterious smile. I have one more surprise. Charlotte laughed. You've already surprised me enough today. Trust me, this one's different. He gently covered her eyes with a soft scarf. David, I promise you won't walk into a wall. She laughed. I hope not. Holding her hand, he carefully guided her through the cafe. Finally, he stopped. Ready? She nodded. David removed the scarf. Charlotte slowly opened her eyes. She gasped. Table 9 had been transformed. Fresh white roses surrounded the table. Tiny candles flickered softly. Warm fairy lights hung above the window. In the center sat 2 cappuccinos and her favorite cinnamon buns. But something else caught her attention. The wooden surface of table 9 looked different. David smiled. I had it restored while you were away. Charlotte gently ran her fingers across the polished wood. Then she noticed a small engraved brass plaque on the edge of the table. It read, Every great love story begins with a simple hello. Charlotte and David tears instantly filled her eyes. You named the table after us? David shook his head. No, I dedicated a small part of it to us. This table gave me the greatest gift of my life. It deserved a thank you. Charlotte looked around the cafe. Everything felt magical. Everything felt like home. David reached into his coat pocket. Charlotte laughed. David, you already proposed months ago, he smiled. I know. This isn't another ring. He pulled out a small silver key. Charlotte looked confused. A key? He nodded. It's for the apartment above the cafe. Her eyes widened. You rented it? David smiled. No, I bought it. Charlotte covered her mouth in surprise. I wanted our first home to be close to the place where our story began. She threw her arms around him. I don't care where we live, as long as I'm with you. David smiled. Then I guess we're both home. As evening settled over Stockholm, they sat together at table 9, sipping warm cappuccinos just like the day they first met. Charlotte looked at the famous table and smiled. You know, it really does have magic. David laughed softly. I don't think the magic was ever in the table. Charlotte looked at him. Then where was it? David gently took her hand. It was always in the two people willing to sit down and truly see each other. Outside, snowflakes drifted quietly past the cafe window. Inside, love had found its way back to where it all began. But the greatest chapter of their story was still waiting to be written. The weeks after Charlotte returned felt like a dream. This time, there were no hospital visits, no long-distance phone calls, no empty chairs at table 9. Every morning, Charlotte helped David open Fika Haven before the first customers arrived. She learned how to make cappuccinos with perfect milk foam. David laughed every time she drew a crooked heart on top. "I think that heart looks more like a potato." Charlotte smiled. "It's handmade. That makes it special." David took a sip and grinned. "Then I'll happily drink potato coffee for the rest of my life." They both laughed, and for the first time in months, the cafe echoed with pure happiness again. With Charlotte's father fully recovered, the wedding plans finally resumed. They could have chosen a grand hotel or a luxurious venue overlooking the sea. Instead, they chose the place where everything had begun. Fika Haven. When Mrs. Ingrid heard the news, she clapped her hands with excitement. "A wedding in this cafe? I've been waiting years for this." Even Eric laughed. "I guess I'll have to make coffee in a suit." For the next month, everyone helped prepare. Neighbors hung warm white lights around the cafe windows, fresh flowers decorated every corner. Charlotte placed small glass jars filled with candles on each table. David polished every coffee cup until it sparkled. But one thing remained untouched. Table 9. It stood beside the window exactly where it had always been, waiting quietly, just as it had waited for so many love stories before theirs. On the morning of the wedding, soft snow began falling over Stockholm. The city looked as though it had been wrapped in white silk. Inside the cafe, close friends and family gathered with warm smiles. David stood near the front, wearing a navy blue suit. His hands trembled slightly. Eric nudged him playfully. "Nervous?" David laughed. "More than I expected. You've served coffee to hundreds of strangers. But somehow, standing here is the hardest thing I've ever done." Eric smiled. "That's because this one matters." The cafe door slowly opened. Everyone turned. Charlotte stepped inside, wearing a simple white wedding dress with a long winter coat over her shoulders. She carried a small bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. She wasn't wearing expensive jewelry. She didn't need it. Her smile was enough to light up the room. As she walked toward David, he couldn't take his eyes off her. When she reached him, she whispered, "You remembered the cinnamon buns, didn't you?" David laughed softly. "I wasn't going to risk forgetting your favorite." She smiled. "Good answer." The ceremony was intimate and filled with emotion. The officiant spoke about love, friendship, and choosing one another every day. Then came the vows. David looked into Charlotte's eyes. "When you first walked into this cafe, I thought you were just another customer. I never imagined you would become my best friend, my greatest blessing, and the person who taught me that home isn't a place. It's wherever you are." Charlotte wiped away a tear before reading her vows. "I spent years writing letters to someone I hadn't met. I always wondered if the person reading them would understand my heart." She smiled at David. "Now I know. You understood it before I even gave you the notebook. I promised to choose you, on the easy days, and especially on the difficult ones." With tears in their eyes, they exchanged rings. The officiant smiled warmly. "By the love you have shared and the promises you have made today, I now pronounce you husband and wife." David gently kissed Charlotte as applause filled the cafe. Mrs. Ingrid cried openly. Eric cheered louder than anyone else. Outside, snowflakes continued to fall, as if Stockholm itself were celebrating with them. That evening, after the guests had left, David and Charlotte remained alone in the cafe. The candles still flickered softly. The aroma of fresh coffee lingered in the air. They sat together at table 9, just as they had done on countless Saturdays. David poured 2 cappuccinos. Charlotte smiled. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, David laughed. I think that's going to take some getting used to. She gently rested her head on his shoulder. So, do you think table 9 is lucky? David looked at the worn wooden table. I think it simply reminds people to slow down, to put away their phones, to look into each other's eyes, and to truly listen. Charlotte smiled. Maybe that's the real secret. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the little coffee shop had witnessed yet another first date become a forever love. But life still had one more beautiful surprise waiting for David and Charlotte. 10 years passed. The little coffee shop in Gamla Stan, Stockholm, was still standing on the same quiet cobblestone street. The wooden floors had become a little older. The walls now displayed photographs of smiling couples from every stage of life. Some photos showed nervous first dates. Others showed engagements, weddings, anniversaries, and even babies sitting in high chairs beside their parents. At the center of every picture, there was one familiar place. Table 9. David and Charlotte had changed too. David's hair showed the first signs of gray around his temples. Charlotte had finally achieved the dream she once thought was impossible. She published her very first novel. The title was simple: Table 9. It wasn't just a love story. It was a story about hope, patience, and how ordinary moments can quietly change an entire life. The novel became one of Sweden's best-selling books. Readers from across the country traveled to Fika Haven just to see the famous table that had inspired it. Whenever someone asked Charlotte, "Is the story true?" she would smile and answer, "The emotions are." One bright Saturday morning, the cafe was busier than ever. Young couples filled almost every seat. Some laughed nervously on first dates, others sat in comfortable silence, already knowing each other's thoughts. Near the window, Table 9 was occupied once again. But this time, not by strangers. By David, Charlotte, and their 8-year-old daughter, Lily Anderson. Lily looked curiously at the framed photographs covering the wall. "Mama?" Charlotte smiled. "Yes, sweetheart? Why does everyone always ask for this table?" Charlotte looked at David. "You tell her." David chuckled. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I like your version better." David looked at his daughter with a warm smile. Many years ago, a young woman walked into this cafe every Saturday. She always ordered a cappuccino and a cinnamon bun. Lily's eyes grew wide. "Was that Mama?" Charlotte laughed. "It was." David continued. "She carried a blue notebook everywhere, and she always sat right here." He gently touched the surface of Table 9. Then one day, a very nervous cafe owner decided to sit across from her because there were no other tables left. Lily giggled. "Were you nervous, Daddy?" "Very. I almost spilled my own coffee." Charlotte laughed. "He's leaving out the best part." Lily looked at her mother. "What part?" Charlotte smiled. "I fell in love with him long before I admitted it." David looked at her in surprise. "You never told me that." She grinned. "I know. I wanted to tell you when we were old." Just then, the cafe door opened. A young man and woman stepped inside, looking around nervously. "It looks full," the young man whispered. David smiled. Actually, he stood up from Table 9. "This table is free." Charlotte looked at him and immediately understood. She smiled. "It's yours." The couple thanked them and sat down. Neither of them noticed how everyone in the cafe exchanged quiet smiles. Mrs. Ingrid, now in her 80s, was sitting in her usual corner with a cup of tea. She winked at David. Another first date. David smiled. "Let's hope it becomes another forever." As evening approached, David locked the front door of the cafe. The family stood outside, beneath the glowing streetlights. Snowflakes drifted gently through the cold Swedish air. Lily slipped her small hands into her parents' hands. Daddy? Yes? Do you think Table 9 is really magical? David looked through the calf window at the quiet wooden table. Then he smiled. I don't think the table creates love. I think it reminds people to slow down, to put away distractions, to listen, to laugh, and to truly see the person sitting across from them. Charlotte gently rested her head on his shoulder. The magic isn't in the wood, it's in the time people choose to spend together. Lily smiled. I like that. As they walked home through the peaceful streets of Stockholm, the lights of Fika Haven glowed warmly behind them. Inside, Table 9 stood silently by the window, waiting, not for famous people, not for perfect people, just for two strangers willing to sit down, share a cup of coffee, and begin a conversation. Because every unforgettable love story starts the same way, not with grand promises, not with perfect timing, but with one simple hello. And sometimes, one ordinary wooden table becomes the quiet witness to a lifetime of love. Thank you for spending your time with David and Charlotte. If this story warmed your heart, remember that love isn't about finding the perfect place. It's about making ordinary moments unforgettable with the right person. Until our next story, take care, keep believing in love, and never underestimate the power of a simple conversation over a cup of coffee.